The signal came in on a frequency nobody was supposed to be monitoring anymore. Petty Officer Dara Solis had been monitoring it anyway, had been for 11 months, ever since the Yosegi array went officially dark, and the Navy decided the outer listening posts weren't worth the power budget. She sat in the cramped basement of what had once been a regional data hub outside Osaka, running the feeds through a repurposed cooling unit she'd rewired herself, eating rice crackers she bought from a vending machine 2 floors up, and waiting. She didn't know what she was waiting for until it arrived. The signal wasn't a message. It wasn't a distress call or a weapons lock or anything the threat recognition filters were designed to catch. It was more like a presence, a pressure at the edge of perception, the way you feel a crowd before you see it. Dara sat up very straight in her folding chair. Her cracker fell to the floor. She pulled her headset on with both hands and listened, really listened, for the first time in months, and understood within 30 seconds that the thing producing the signal was not from anywhere near this star. She should have called Fleet Command. She had the codes. She had the priority channel, the authentication keys, the encrypted relay that bypassed civilian infrastructure entirely. She had all the right tools for exactly this situation, because 12 years ago, humanity had built those tools with great seriousness and enormous expense, all in preparation for the day something like this might happen. Instead, she picked up her personal comm and called Kenji. "I found something," she said. Kenji Watanabe was a civilian contractor, technically, though the word civilian felt inadequate for someone who had personally designed 3 generations of deep-field sensor arrays and once talked a panicking admiral out of firing a kinetic impactor at an anomalous reading that turned out to be a migrating pod of bioluminescent deep-sea organisms. He was 53 years old, built like a man who had spent his life hunched over a desk with reading glasses perpetually pushed up into hair that had been going gray since his 20s. He arrived at Dara's basement 40 minutes after her call, slightly out of breath, carrying 2 coffees from the machine 2 floors up. He handed her one. He listened to the signal for 6 minutes without speaking. Then he says, "Oh, yeah," she said. "How long?" "It started 9 hours ago. I've been recording everything." Kenji set his coffee down very carefully, the way a man sets something down when his hands have begun to shake, and he does not want this to be visible. "How large a fleet produces a signal like this?" "I don't know," she said. "I've never seen a signal like this." He was quiet for a moment. "Neither have I." They both looked at the readout. The pressure on the frequency had increased while they were talking, not dramatically, not like a jump or a surge, but the way incoming weather increases, gradually, inevitably, with a weight that the instruments registered before the humans could fully process. "I should call Fleet," she said. "Yes. They're going to ask how I've been running this station." "Yes." She picked up the priority channel anyway. When the duty officer answered, she said 4 words. "They're already here. Look." The Gorath did not announce themselves. This was, Dara would later understand, characteristic. They did not broadcast demands, did not send emissaries, did not perform the diplomatic theater that humanity had spent decades preparing to receive. They arrived the way a tide arrives, without ceremony, without declaration, the way a fact of nature simply becomes true. 72 hours after Dara's call, Fleet had confirmed the approach vectors of what their instruments were calling, with increasing nervousness, approximately 1,400 vessels. Some of these vessels were large enough to generate their own gravitational influence on the outer system's smaller bodies. The Gorath were not, as far as anyone could determine, interested in communication. The first engagement happened over the Martian corridor, and humanity lost it decisively and fast. Not catastrophically. The fleet had time to fall back in reasonable order, which was a phrase that meant a great deal to the admirals and almost nothing to the crews of the 47 ships that did not complete the withdrawal. But the shape of the engagement was clear from the first exchange. The Gorath weapons punched through human shielding at ranges that made counterfire nearly theoretical. Their drives produced accelerations that human pilots couldn't track in real time, and their formation discipline suggested a command structure of either extreme sophistication or complete automation. Possibly both. Fleet Command convened an emergency session. The session produced, after 16 hours, a strategic assessment document that ran to 400 pages and could be summarized in one sentence. "We cannot win this conventionally." Dara was not at the session. Dara was in a converted freight bay on Okinawa Station, surrounded by sensor analysts, engineers, 3 fleet intelligence officers who had decided she was now essential, and Kenji, who had set up a folding table in the corner and was eating a bowl of noodles he had somehow procured and not offered to share. The bay smelled of solder and recycled air, and the particular anxious sweat of people who had been awake for 40 hours. Their comms are coherent state entangled, said a young analyst named Marta, pointing at a display. Interference is basically not an option. You'd need a dedicated jamming array the size of a station, and you'd buy yourself maybe 4 minutes before they compensated. Weapons? Said Fleet Captain Adeze Okonkwo, who was technically in command of the room and practically just trying to keep up. Rail impactors work if you can close to range, which you mostly can't. Energy weapons work at range, but their ablative hulls dissipate the thermal load faster than we can accumulate it. Nukes are interesting. The analyst paused. Nukes are interesting in a complicated way. Interesting how? In that we've fired 22 of them and killed 8 of their ships. But their ships learn. The last 3 launches, they identified the warheads in the boost phase and intercepted them before they got anywhere useful. The room was quiet. So they adapt, said Captain Okonkwo, very fast. Kenji looked up from his noodles. How fast do we adapt? Everyone looked at him. He seemed unbothered by this. Them learning our tactics is only a problem if we stop changing our tactics, he said. How fast do we change? Not doctrine. Not formally. I mean, how fast does a crew in the field actually change what they're doing when what they're doing stops working? Dara knew what he was getting at. She'd seen it, on small scales, in the data from the Martian corridor, moments where individual ships had done things that weren't in the handbook, things that had surprised the Gorath for seconds, maybe minutes, before the response came. Small things, human-shaped things. You're not talking about fleet, she said. I'm talking about people, Kenji said. He set his bowl down. What does a crew do when they're scared, exhausted, outgunned, and the official plan has stopped working? They improvise. They cover for each other. They try things that are probably stupid. Sometimes the stupid things work. He paused. The Gorath are very good at fighting a war. I'm asking if they know how to fight a mess. The answer turned out to be imperfectly. It took 6 weeks to figure this out, and the 6 weeks were not good weeks. The Gorath advanced through the outer system with the methodical patience of something that had done this before, to other civilizations, and knew the shape of the end. They were not cruel, precisely. There was no evidence of deliberate civilian targeting, no atrocities in the way humanity feared atrocities, but they were thorough, and their thoroughness had a weight to it that pressed on every human institution, every radio broadcast, every face looking up at a sky that now contained things that should not have been there. The world did not end. People still went to work, mostly, or tried to. Shops stayed open in strange, erratic ways, people buying what they could think of, not knowing what to prepare for. Children still argued over small things. Someone in Dara's building kept cooking fish at 11 p.m., and the smell drifted through the ventilation as it always had. Life was not suspended. It continued in its particular human way, lumpy and distracted and resilient in directions nobody planned for. Dara found this both exhausting and oddly steadying. She worked 20-hour days, slept on a cot in the freight bay, and ate whatever Kenji or Marta put in front of her. She had stopped calling her mother, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know what to say, and her mother would hear it in her voice, and they would both spend the call trying to protect the other from the truth, which was that nobody knew how long this would go. The tactical picture changed on day 41, and it changed because of a destroyer called the Ibis. The Ibis was a second-hand escort vessel, old enough that its fire control systems had analog backups, commanded by a lieutenant commander named Petra Navarro, who was 29 years old, had never expected to be in a battle of this scale, and dealt with this the way she dealt with most unexpected situations, by being annoying about details. The Ibis had been covering a civilian evacuation corridor when a Gorath pursuit element caught up with them. They couldn't outrun the pursuit, and they couldn't outfight it, and the evacuation convoy couldn't maneuver. Navarro made a decision that was not in the handbook. She ordered her crew to vent the ship's reactor coolant in a controlled burst on their port side, creating a plasma fog dense enough to screw with the Gorath targeting sensors, then used the 6 seconds of degraded targeting to make a run directly at the lead Gorath vessel, close enough that both ships were inside each other's effective weapons envelope, which meant both ships also couldn't fire without hitting themselves. The Ibis and the lead pursuit vessel spent 90 seconds sailing side by side at approximately the same velocity, close enough that the crew could see the Goreth hull plates in detail. Navarro used those 90 seconds to transmit everything she'd learned about the Goreth targeting systems during the engagement to a fleet relay, then broke away and covered the remaining evacuation time from a position the other pursuit elements couldn't fire on without risk of friendly fire on their own lead ship. The convoy escaped. The Ibis was heavily damaged, and Navarro had a broken collarbone from a console impact. Her damage control team improvised pressure seals from emergency ration packaging, which Dara read about in the after action and had to stop and sit with for a moment because it was the most human thing she'd heard in 6 weeks. The Goreth had not apparently calculated for a crew that would patch hull breaches with food wrappers. Kenji put the Ibis report on the main display and stood in front of it for a long time. Then he turned around. "We've been thinking about this wrong," he said. "Define wrong," said Captain Okonkwo. "We've been trying to win engagements, individual encounters. We're not going to win enough individual encounters. They're faster, longer ranged, and they learn fast. But they're learning a curriculum." He picked up a stylus and drew a circle on the display, something rough and immediate. "We keep giving them the same tests. Formation tactics, fire concentration, withdrawal patterns. Every time they solve a test, we run it again with a minor variation. They solve it again. We're teaching them to fight us. What we haven't tried is giving them a test they can't study for because it doesn't exist yet." "Novel tactics," said the intelligence officer, Lieutenant Ferreira, who had a habit of saying things like that, reducing the idea to a label as if the label explained it. "Not tactics," said Kenji. "Behavior. Tactics is what you do when you have a plan. Behavior is what you do when you don't. What does a human crew do when everything goes wrong? They're out of ammunition, the comms are down, and the commander is incapacitated. They do something. They do something specific and human and unpredictable because people do things. They don't just stop." He set the stylus down. "The Goreth plan extraordinarily well. I don't think they've had to deal, at scale, with an enemy that doesn't." The room thought about this. "You're saying our incompetence is a strategic asset," said Marta. "I'm saying our adaptability is a strategic asset, yes, but also—" He hesitated. "Also, yes. Somewhat. They called the operation, with a bureaucratic lack of poetry, Distributed Response Protocol 7. What it meant in practice was that Fleet stopped issuing detailed engagement orders and started issuing objectives. Here is what we need to accomplish. Figure out how. Report what worked so others can steal it." It was, to put it charitably, a shock to the organizational culture. There were admirals who found the whole thing structurally offensive. There were captains who thrived. The captains who thrived tended to be the ones who had always slightly bent the rule book, who had crew cultures built on trust rather than fear, who knew their ships down to the bolt level because they'd fixed problems themselves rather than waiting for the maintenance cycle. They were not, as a group, the most decorated officers in Fleet. Several of them were technically under review for various protocol violations. Navarro, her collarbone in a sling, was given command of a squadron. Dara watched the results come in over the following 3 weeks and felt something she could only describe as complicated pride. Not the clean kind, not the kind you could stand up straight in, but the sideways kind, the kind that comes with knowing the cost. Every tactical innovation was paid for somewhere. Every piece of data in the after-action reports represented a ship that had survived something by the thinnest possible margin, crews who had used the last thing they had because everything else was gone. She kept a list, not of victories. Fleet tracked those. She kept a list of the small things, the Ibis's food wrappers. A crew on the Serengeti who had kept a damaged weapons system operational by manually rotating fire control inputs in a rotating shift because the automation was offline. 4 crew members running calculations in their heads and shouting the numbers to each other across a damaged compartment, like something from a century before computers. The captain of the Rio Grande, who, when his ship lost all external sensors, had his crew suit up and go to the external observation ports and literally look out the windows and call corrections to the helm. They'd survived 20 minutes of engagement that way, not through any particular heroism, just through the stubborn refusal to accept that the loss of the technology meant the loss of the capability. The Goreth, in the intelligence assessments, were beginning to show something that looked like uncertainty. Their response times to novel human behaviors were increasing. Their formation discipline, still superb, was developing what Marta's team called overcorrection patterns. Situations where the Gorath response to a human action was technically correct, but slightly miscalibrated, as if they were solving for the average behavior of the enemy rather than the actual behavior of this specific crew in this specific moment. They're building a model of us, Marta said, a statistical model, and the model is getting better, but it's also getting more confident, and our behavior is getting less predictable. A confident model of an unpredictable subject, said Dara, makes for interesting errors. The engagement at the Kepler station anchorage was where things shifted. Not a turning point. Nobody could afford to call anything a turning point yet, but a shift in the texture of the fight, something that the people who survived it would describe years later in ways that didn't quite line up because they had each experienced something different, and the difference was the point. Navarro's squadron was covering the evacuation of Kepler station's civilian population, 18,000 people. The Gorath main advance had arrived ahead of schedule, 3 hours ahead, which on the scale of interstellar conflict was the kind of margin that ended things quickly. The evacuation was 60% complete. Navarro had 12 ships, one of which was already damaged from the previous engagement, and was facing what the instruments were calling a Gorath formation of roughly 60 vessels, with the main fleet still coming up behind. She did not have a plan in the handbook for this. What she had was 12 crews who had been operating under Distributed Response Protocol 7 for 3 weeks, which meant they had been improvising, failing, reporting failures, stealing from other people's failures, and doing it all in an environment where the expectation was try something rather than wait. They were, to use Kenji's phrase, practiced at the mess. What she ordered them to do was not, strictly speaking, a military maneuver. She told them to be loud, not metaphorically. She ordered every ship in her squadron to transmit on every available frequency simultaneously. Communications, sensors, decoy signals, the emergency broadcast band, the civilian distress frequencies, a music broadcast that someone in her crew had been running on a loop for morale that was apparently still technically transmitting to the external comm. She ordered them to move erratically, not in any pattern, not in any formation, each ship making its own decisions about heading and velocity based on local sensor readings, which meant the Gorath were now tracking 12 ships doing 12 completely different things simultaneously. She ordered her own weapon systems to fire and cease fire in irregular intervals that did not correspond to any targeting logic, because she had learned, through the IBIS after action, that Gorath defense allocation was computationally expensive and pattern-dependent. If you fired without a pattern, you forced them to treat every shot as potentially the real one. She let 2 of her ships get close enough to be dangerous to the Gorath, close enough that the Gorath had to allocate response, and pulled them back before they were destroyed, which forced the Gorath to model the feint and recalculate. And then she did it again with different ships, which forced them to model the feint of the feint. None of this was in the handbook. The Gorath were very good. They adapted. In the first 6 minutes, they had contained most of what Navarro was doing, and their formation was beginning to close. Navarro saw this on the display and understood she had maybe 8 minutes before they adjusted fully. She used 4 of those minutes to tell the station that she needed the evacuation to finish in 8 minutes, or it wasn't going to finish. She used the other 4 minutes to do something she had never, in her career, done or imagined doing, which was to open the command channel to her entire squadron and say, "I'm out of ideas. What do you have?" The answers came back in 40 seconds. Not clean tactical proposals, half-formed things, questions disguised as suggestions. Someone who said, "I might be able to get us 2 more minutes if and trailed off," and she said, "Do it." Someone else who said, "What if we," and she said yes before they finished, because yes was faster than no, and she trusted these people in a way that was no longer about rank or protocol. It was about the fact that they had been in the mess together for 3 weeks and knew each other in the specific, intimate way of people who have fixed things with their hands in the dark. What the squadron did in the next 4 minutes was not, in any strict military sense, beautiful. It was chaotic and expensive, and 3 ships took significant damage, and 1 crew had to deal with a partial decompression event during an active engagement, while simultaneously trying to implement a maneuver their captain had made up 30 seconds ago. But it held long enough. The Gorath formation, adapting and adapting and adapting, made an error, a small one, a miscalculation, about the behavior of a damaged ship that was moving in ways a damaged ship, in the Gorath model, was not supposed to move. Because in the Gorath model, a damaged ship began to prioritize self-preservation, and the Rio Frio's crew was doing something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with self-preservation, and everything to do with the 11,000 people who hadn't made it to the transports yet. The Gorath formation opened a gap. Navarro hit the gap with everything she had left. The formation didn't close in time. The evacuation completed with 6 minutes to spare. Dara was watching the feed from Okinawa Station when it happened. She was surrounded by people who understood what they were seeing, and the moment the numbers confirmed the evacuation completion, the room did something she wouldn't have predicted for a room full of analysts and officers and engineers in the middle of a war. It made noise. Not cheering, exactly. Something rawer than cheering. Something that came from somewhere below the professional surface that everyone had been maintaining for weeks. People grabbed each other. Someone laughed. The laugh spread in a way that laughs sometimes do, catching something that needed releasing, and for a moment the freight bay on Okinawa Station was a room full of people who had forgotten, just for a moment, to be controlled about it. Dara didn't laugh. She sat very still and looked at the numbers, and thought about the Ibis's food wrappers, and Navarro's 8-minute clock, and the crews she was not going to put on the list because they hadn't made it. Kenji appeared beside her with a coffee he'd gotten from somewhere. He set it in front of her. "You should sleep," he said, "after I write the after-action report. Write it after you sleep. It'll be better." She looked at him. "You didn't sleep for 4 days during the first engagement, and my report was terrible. I wrote 14 pages about sensor harmonics and completely missed the behavioral pattern that you identified, rested, in 40 minutes. He settled into the adjacent chair, which was not particularly comfortable and was designed for people significantly shorter than him. "You're better at this than I am. Sleep." She drank the coffee instead. It was vending machine coffee from the machine 2 floors up. Terrible coffee. The kind that had been terrible for 11 months. And she had grown fond of it in the specific way you grow fond of a constant thing in an inconsistent world. "They're going to adapt," she said. "Whatever we figured out at Kepler, they'll model it. They already are." "Yes. So we have to keep changing." "Yes." "That's not a strategy," she said. "That's just life. That's just what people do." Kenji was quiet for a moment. Maybe that's the strategy. She thought about that. The signal she'd picked up 11 months ago in the basement in Osaka, the one that had been a presence before it was a fact. The way it had felt sitting in her folding chair with the cracker on the floor, like something that had been moving toward this moment for a very long time. She thought about the Gorateth, and what it meant to be something that could cross interstellar distances and field 1,400 ships and still in some essential way be unprepared for a crew that fixed hull breaches with food wrappers. "What do they want?" she said. "We still don't know. No, they haven't destroyed anything they didn't have to. They haven't communicated. They haven't tried to negotiate or demand or explain. They just advance." "They may not think communication is relevant," Kenji said. "They may have done this enough times that they don't expect the math to change." The math changed. A little. Enough. He thought about this. Enough for Kepler. We don't know about the rest. She knew that. She knew the scope of the thing. The distances, the numbers, the fundamental asymmetry that had not gone away because one squadron held one anchorage for 8 extra minutes. The war was not over. The war was perhaps slightly less over than it had been 3 days ago. This was real, and it mattered, and it was also, by any reasonable accounting, a very small thing. She had found, over the past months, that very small things were what she was working with. Data, at the margins, patterns in the noise. The small moments where behavior deviated from the model and became, briefly, something the model hadn't accounted for. "I'm going to write the report," she said. Kenji sighed. "Go to sleep, Kenji. Yours will be better, too." The report she wrote, at 3 in the morning on Okinawa Station with bad coffee cooling next to her keyboard, was 60 pages long and was classified within 6 hours of submission. 3 pages of it concerned the specific tactical actions at Kepler. The other 57 concerned something she called, in the document, behavioral unpredictability as emergent strategic capability, which was an extremely formal way of saying that humanity was difficult to predict because human beings, in conditions of extreme stress, tended to do whatever was necessary and possible and slightly insane in ways that were genuinely hard to model without already being human. She wrote it, and then she sat for a while in the empty freight bay. Everyone else had finally gone to sleep and thought about a 16-year-old girl sitting in a basement in Osaka, eating rice crackers, monitoring a dead frequency on repurposed equipment because it seemed worth doing. Nobody had told her to do that. There was no protocol for it. It wasn't in any job description. It was something she had done because she was curious and persistent and slightly irritating about things she cared about, which was, she supposed, a very human combination. The signal had come in on a frequency nobody was supposed to be monitoring. She had been monitoring it anyway. She closed the report, saved it, pushed it to the secure relay, and went to find somewhere to sleep. The war went on. Of course it did. Wars do not resolve in 60 pages or 6 weeks or one well-executed 8-minute hold. The Gorath advance slowed. It did not stop. Humanity lost stations and outposts and ships and people, and gained data, and changed, and lost more, and changed again, in the grinding imperfect way of a species that had never been very good at stopping and had become, over millennia, quite practiced at going on anyway. Navarro's squadron became a template. The distributed response protocol, which still had that terrible name, because the admirals who named things were not the ones implementing them, spread through fleet in the way that useful things spread when conditions make them necessary. Imperfectly, inconsistently, with resistance from some quarters and passionate adoption from others, with 100 variations that were all slightly different because the people implementing them were different, and that was the point. The Gorath continued to adapt. They were very good at adapting. But there is a limit to how well you can model something that is actively, deliberately, cheerfully refusing to be predictable, and humanity had turned out to have a considerable talent for cheerful refusal, for patching things with what was available, for covering each other in dark corridors, for doing whatever was possible and slightly insane when everything else had run out. This was not, in the final accounting, sufficient to win the war in any clean or dramatic sense. What it was sufficient for was this. The Gorath advance, which had the shape of an inevitability when it arrived, did not move like an inevitability anymore. It moved like a contested thing, like something that was being argued with, point by point, system by system, engagement by engagement, by a species that had a very deep habit of argument. Dara received a promotion she didn't ask for and ignored a posting she was supposed to take, staying instead in the freight bay on Okinawa Station, because the sensor array she'd set up there was the best in the inner system and nobody else was reading the data the way she read it. She kept her list. She kept the bad coffee. Kenji kept his folding table in the corner, and his noodles, and his habit of saying things that were obvious once you heard them and not at all obvious before. Marta found a pattern in the Gorath overcorrection data that turned out to be significant in a way that took 3 weeks to fully understand, and then turned out to be very significant indeed. Significant enough that it appeared in strategy documents circulating at the highest levels, still attributed to a footnote in Dara's classified report, which was how these things went. The fish cooking neighbor in Dara's building kept cooking fish at 11 p.m. She started looking forward to it. The smell was a kind of message. Things continue. The ordinary things, the specific human things, the things that make no sense to model because they're not strategic, they're just people doing what people do, they continued. The Gorath had come expecting a particular kind of ending. They were getting something else, something messier and more stubborn and harder to calculate. Something that fixed hull breaches with food wrappers and monitored dead frequencies and called its friend instead of Fleet Command, because sometimes the right move is the one that makes no official sense. Somewhere in the outer system, the main fleet pressed on. And somewhere in the outer system, 12 squadrons that didn't fight like any textbook pressed back. Each one slightly different from the others. Each one learning from the other's failures. All of them together constituting something that the Gorath's models were having increasing trouble with. Not winning, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but arguing. Loudly, stubbornly, with food wrappers and bad coffee and the specific human conviction that the fact that something is hard is not the same as the fact that it's over. Dara Solis poured herself the last of the vending machine coffee, pulled her headset on, and listened. The frequency was full of noise, which was different from silence. Noise meant things were still happening. She got to work.